one where I went to New York City for the first time. So I was a Texan, born and raised, never really fit in. I didn't look like a Texan. I didn't act like a Texan. I always wanted to go to New York. And it was funny because people were always like, where are you from? New York City? And I'm like, no, I'm a Texan. But I didn't feel like I was. So when I was a teenager at the ballet school that I studied at, we all decided to audition for a summer program in New York. So this specific company, Joffrey Ballet in New York City, had auditions in Texas. So one day we decided to attend and go audition and see if we could get in to this summer program. Well, luck would have it, Shannon and I both got in. And our parents I'm so grateful for this, were able to provide support and financial, and they allowed us to go, because it's like for these teenagers, living alone in New York City, it was wild. So we got in, and this was a dream of mine. Joffrey Ballet is more of a contemporary, more edgy. So it was like right up my alley. And I was stoked to just get out of Texas and get, when you're a teenager, you want to like get away from your parents. But like this was intense. So luckily, my dad, Al, had an uncle who was a retired police officer. And he had connections to get us a dormitory in Stevens Tech in Hoboken, New Jersey. So Hoboken is like it has a beautiful view of New York. So this was like up on a hill. And believe me, I remember the hill going up and down every day after ballet class. But it was perfect. Since it was summer, nobody else was there. It was just Shannon and I in this dorm. And we were very blessed. Of course, we ran out of money like immediately, but we were getting to understand what it was to live alone. We were getting to understand what it was to be in like this like metropolitan area. And I remember the first time that I stepped out onto this New York City streets. Well, in Hoboken, you take like this PATH train. So it's like a subway, but a little bit like less than a subway. It's not as grandiose, but it's so a smaller version of a subway. And I remember I walked out onto Grove Street, and this feeling of like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. Like, this is my environmental center. And I just had this exhale. And all that feeling of not fitting in, and all that feeling of like, I remember being in Texas and just like being in bed at night, like thinking, oh my gosh, I'm the only one awake in this whole state, in the whole world. And that loneliness, I felt like it just kind of sloughed off as soon as I walked onto the streets of New York. It was like a movie. So we started doing ballet studies in New York. It was a whole summer program. It was very intense. Shannon was more advanced. I was actually, come to find out, more in just like the open classes. Like, we didn't even do point work. So I started to come into this acknowledgement that like, I might not be as awesome and as great as I thought. And I know you're like, oh, great, I'm sure you're fine. I'm sure you're really, really great. And I mean, I was great and I was good and I was like, a big fish in my small pond. But like, to come into that self-awareness that like, holy crap, I'm probably, just in these like open classes and they're just taking my money and I'm, not as good as I thought I was. It opens your eyes, and it's pretty rewarding if you allow it to be, because you have one of two choices. You could quit, or you can work really hard to get better. And I was presented with that choice, and I decided to work harder. So the first day of Joffrey, I remember I was on birth control, and oh my God, I got so sick. I don't know if it was waking up early. I don't know if it was the excitement, the nerves. I was throwing up in the subway. So I remember getting right out of one of the cars and throwing up on the platform. I'm like, oh, great, this is my first day. And I arrived there and I'm trying to muscle through it. And I remember I'm at the bar and I'm like, I'm going to vomit. I'm going to be sick. Run to the bathroom. And like this was my first, impression. Ugh. So I go back into the teacher and I ask that I could sit down and watch. And I remember thinking, like, oh, I'm really sick. It's not that I'm overwhelmed or I'm not, it's not that I am thinking I'm not good enough and that's why I'm sitting out, which came as, a part of my personality. I remember as a child feeling inadequate or feeling overwhelmed and like saying, ooh, I have a tummy ache, or ooh, I, stabbed myself in the eye and I got to sit down and watch and not do it. Because it was that feeling of failure or feeling of just not adding up to the people around me. Comparisons. So I remember thinking while watching everybody in class, like, oh my gosh, I really am sick. I'm not faking it, or I'm not, trying to get out of doing the work. I really wanted to do it, but I was actually nauseous. But it only lasted that one day, thank goodness, and I was able to, do these classes, and I was able to, enjoy New York. And it was like right on 6th Ave, and right below the studio was Balducci's, and it was like Italian food. All you did is smell Italian food all day. And then I remember, like, again, we had no money, and I would always go to Mamoun's before Mamoun's like became like a chain, which is like falafels. And I remember I would get a falafel and an orange crush soda. Oh my goodness. And like I think it was like $5. It was something stupid cheap, and that's what I ate. I would eat a salad here and there, but like it was all day you're dancing, and it was exhausting, and it was wonderful, and it was a dream come true. And Shannon was doing great, and I remember, I had a fake ID, and so Shannon was of age, and we used to go out. We met a girl, and she was like a model, and so we would hang out with her, and all three of us would go out. I don't know how we survived, and especially the way I dressed. Oh my gosh. So Shannon likes, Shannon loves these stories. But we would go like to these clubs, these New York clubs, like the Palladium, the Limelight, the Church, I think. I don't know. And seeing that I had a fake ID and I dressed the way I did, again, not fitting into Texas ways of life, but fitting into New York pretty well, they would let us in. And they would always let me in, and then I'm like, oh, she's with me, Shannon's with me, and they're like, all right, you too, because Shannon was very straight-laced and very Texas. And so, but we would get into these clubs, and it wasn't like we weren't drinking, we weren't doing drugs, of course not. All we wanted to do was dance. And so we would go to these clubs all hours of the night after dancing all day, and then we would dance all night and like walk around the city and like the 2 o'clock. And it's true, nobody ever is really asleep. And we met some guys at one of these cafes. I guess it was like Joe Jr. So it was like a diner really, and they worked there. And I think they were Greek, and so they would take us out, and we would go dancing, and we felt a little protected with a couple of guys. But there'd be a lot of times where it would just be us ladies, and maybe a couple of other girls walking. And I'll tell you Shannon's favorite story is there was the one time we were walking, and it was like 2, 3 in the morning, and there was this homeless gentleman with a poncho, just like in the corner, minding his own business, or so we thought. And we're walking by, I'm chatting away with somebody, and all of a sudden, everybody just starts running. Like all the girls, all the people I'm with have run away. And I'm like, what the heck? Well, then I started getting hit. Luckily, not with anything major, but it was just his cup. He was hitting me with his cup, the poncho man. The poncho man was hitting me with his cup. And I'm like, I'm trying not to laugh, and I'm trying not to be scared, and trying to find where everybody ran to. Well, they ran into this little cafe, I'm sure it was open 24 hours, and it was like, French and everything. And I barge in after them being assaulted. And everybody's like, with their coffee, and they just like turn and look, and they don't care. And it's very like, oh, all in a day. And I'm like, this is great. This is where I want to be. And so doing the dance program, I learned a lot about ballet, but I also learned like where I wanted to be. And during this summer pro intensive, they had auditions, and it was an audition for the end of the season performance. And since I wasn't in any advanced classes, I was just in the open classes. I still was kind of ballsy, and I did audition for this, and I got into the jazz piece, which was a massive piece, tons of performers, and again, feeling a little bit, oh, it was like a little bit over my head, but I committed. And so we started rehearsal for this, and I'm the only one like with the open classes. Everybody else is more advanced, and I'm talking like freaks in nature. Their legs are like back here, and they're great. And again, feeling a little inadequate, feeling a little bit like I'm comparing myself to others. And during one of the rehearsals, the actual director of the piece or the choreographer of the piece, he was absent for some reason. I don't know, but it was an evening rehearsal, and he had his rehearsal run by a couple of students, and they were probably my age, maybe a year older, but they were more advanced. And I remember being in this rehearsal, and that my rebellion started to come out because they were getting on me. And my memory to this day, I don't know if they were in the wrong. I was in the wrong. I know I was in the wrong. But I don't know if I misinterpreted how they were correcting me, or they were truly correcting me in a disrespectful manner. But I am not a very good a good person to have that memory, because like I'm biased. So all I can do is say that I remember being disrespected, and I walked out of the rehearsal. Like I stormed out of the rehearsal, and I had the most epic anxiety attack I think I've ever had. I remember being in the bathroom, not being able to breathe, not being able to catch my breath, not being able to stop crying. And I think it was just this overwhelm of realizing that I wasn't as great as I thought I was, and that I was feeling so entitled, and I probably shouldn't have walked out, that I should have stayed and handled it in a much different way. But what is done is done. And so I had this epic anxiety attack. I had some anxiety. Like I said, I was on birth control pills, so a lot of my emotions, a lot of my hormones were just out of whack. I had depression due to the endometriosis. I had anxiety. I wouldn't say across the board, but I would have these, which now I know are like enemy attacks, but I would have these attacks which were filled with anxiety and doubts, and just this energetic like disturbance. Well, then the next day we had rehearsal, or the next evening we had rehearsal, and the choreographer, brought us all, because of course he heard what the heck happened. And I'm just I still have this chip on my shoulder. And he's, apologizing for not being there, and he heard what happened, and he wanted to hear everybody's sides of the story. And I think I had mumbled something under my breath, and I was like, but I can't even remember. I don't even think it was important. But he then in turn didn't take me seriously, didn't, nothing landed anymore. So like whatever happened, I was in the wrong, because I was still snotty. I was being a teenager. I was still like saying something under my breath. So that feeling of not being able to shut up, stuck with me. As I it's like that would you rather be happy or would you rather be right? And I had that feeling of like, oof, that control, and I just wanted to be right. And I learned a lot from that because I wasn't right. You know, I needed to fall in line. I needed to do what I was told, and I needed to listen. And I needed to not have this attitude and had a little bit more forgiveness. So, needless to say, I did get to stay in that piece, and I didn't mess it up. I had this like fear that I was going to forget the choreography or whatever, but like I was in the back, I was fine, and I made it through. But being in New York City, being a teenager in New York City, I learned a lot. There was just the living, living on our own too was big. You know, we're doing our own laundry, we're making our own dinner, we're running out of our own money. You know, we learned a lot. And that's the summer that Bob came and visited and trashed the bathroom. And that's where I learned even more that being this rebellious teenager isn't the answer. He disrespected the whole bathroom that we were lucky enough to get through my uncle, well, Al's uncle, but it was ridiculous. And I remember having to have a conversation with him, and it falling on deaf ears, and how that mirrored basically what I was going through. How I was just rebelling and having so much anger and putting that out into the world that I couldn't hear it. I couldn't see it. And, I forgave Bob for that incident. I don't know if Shannon did, but there was a part that I think I needed to forgive for myself through that Joffrey whole experience, forgiving myself for being kind of a punk and not allowing myself to learn as much as I could. And I did some sabotaging, and I think that was my biggest lesson. And so having my first experience in New York was a lot of emotions and a lot of lessons. But that was my first step into moving towards living and starting a career in the New Jersey, New York area. So I would not replace it with anything.